All right, welcome sixth graders. Today we are going to take some notes on comparing ratios. So if you could open up your notebooks and then go ahead and put in today's date, find your next open page. So we have been doing a lot of work around finding equivalent ratios, right? And different ways to do that. We've talked about some different strategies. So now what we want to start to do is how do we tell when the two ratios are different? How do we start to compare those? And the context that we're going to use for our notes today is shooting free throws. We're going to have two people. So we're going to have Shahid versus Mateo. So we're going to say they were both at basketball practice, and at basketball practice this day, Shahid made 7, but he missed 5. Meanwhile, Mateo made 9 free throws and missed 7. So the question we want to answer is, who was the better shooter that day? So we can't just judge it by how many they made, right? Because they also missed different amounts and they took different amounts of shots, and that's kind of what we're going to explore here. Now, hopefully you remember that there are different types of ratios that we can write. So one ratio we could write would be a part-to-part ratio, where we could do makes to misses. And because we're talking about who was the better shooter, it makes sense for us to put makes on top because that's the part that we're really going to emphasize. So for Shahid, his ratio would be 7 to 5. And for Mateo, his ratio would be 9 to 7. We could also, though, do makes to total shots taken. And in that case, Shahid would be 7 to 12 because we would put the 7 and 5 together. And Mateo would be 9 out of 16. But once again, I want you to notice that we emphasize that makes because that's, for most of us, if we're talking about who's the better shooter, we're going to look at what percentage or what fraction or what ratio of their shots that they're actually making. So first thing we have to do is set up our ratio. So you can either do makes to misses or makes to total, depending on what makes the most sense to you. So strategy number 1 that we can use is we're going to use a common denominator. And really this works for any part of the ratio that's the same. So it could be the same whole, it could be the same part, but we want to make some part of the ratio the same to make it easier to compare. And then depending on what you make the same changes how you interpret the ratio. So I'm going to go ahead and use the makes to misses. So remember Shahid was 7 to 5. Mateo was 9 to 7. So what I want to do is I want to make it so they've both had the same number of misses, or we can make it so they've both taken the same number of shots. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to multiply both of them by the number of misses that the other player made. But if I do that to the bottom number, or one part of the ratio, remember I have to also do it to the other part of the ratio to keep it equivalent. Oops, this should be 5 though, because we want to make sure that we are multiplying both parts by the same number. So now when I do this, I can see that Shahid's new ratio is 7 times 7. So he's going to have 49 makes and 35 misses. Whereas Mateo when he also has 35 misses, is going to have 45 makes. So now when we look at this, because we're comparing and they have the same number of misses, we would expect Shahid to make a few more free throws for the same number of misses. So Shahid would be the better free throw shooter. So that's our first strategy. Our second strategy is more of a visual model. And now we can draw out our own, but I would actually suggest for this one using an app that you can get in self-service. And this app is called Fractions by the Math Learning Center. And the nice thing about this is it allows you to basically kind of do the fractions and be able to draw a picture and compare without having to actually do the sectioning yourself, especially when a lot of our pieces are so close together. So I'm going to show you this from a web browser, because it is also available on the web browser. So your app is going to look something like this. You're going to see all these different tools on the bottom down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select the fraction bar, because that's going to be easier for me. And I'm going to look at, for example, for this, I'm going to do makes to total shots taken. So for Shahid, he made 7 out of 12. So I'm going to section my fraction bar into 12 pieces. I'm going to make it a little bit easier just so it's easier to look at. And for Shahid, he made 7. Right? And then I can actually pick this little right here, that 1/2, and it's going to tell me what fraction of my bar is shaded. And then I'm going to make a second bar for Mateo, but Mateo took 16 shots, so I'm going to take 16. Now the really nice thing about this is you can type in your own total if you need something that's not preset, but 16 is already there for me. Oops. All right, so I'm going to drag these so they are perfectly in line. And then I'm going to go ahead and shade Mateo's to show his 9 makes. All right, so now you can see that they're really, really close to each other, but overall, we can see that there's a larger ratio or a larger part of Shahid's bar that is shaded. So once again, we see that Shahid, right, would be the better shooter in this case if we're comparing Shahid to Mateo. Right, so kind of labeling it to help show our thinking. So that's our second one, is we can use that fraction app. Our third strategy is probably the one that most of your parents would think about using if you were to ask them. And what we're going to do is we're going to change our ratio to a decimal. So once again, we can use a part-to-part or part-to-whole ratio. So if we're looking at Shahid, Shahid had 7 makes. Once again, focusing on that makes first, to 5 misses. And Mateo had 9 makes to 7 misses. So what I'm going to do to change these to a fraction, or to a decimal, is I'm going to take that first number of my ratio, which is 7, and I'm going to divide it by the second number of my ratio. So in this case, it's 5, or it could be a part to whole. It would have been 7 divided by 12. So if I do 7 divided by 5, My decimal ends up being 1.40. And I can just use a calculator for this. My second one, I'm going to do 9 divided by 7, emphasizing that makes first. And that decimal ends up being 1.28 with a bunch of digits afterwards. So now what I'm doing is I'm simply comparing 1.28 to the 1.40. And because I emphasize my makes first, this one's going to be who made the larger ratio of makes, so I want to pick the bigger value. So since 1.40, or 1 and 40 hundredths, is greater than 1 and 28 hundredths, once again we see that Shahid would be the better free throw shooter. So these are just 3 different examples of ways that you can compare ratios. You could still draw pictures and do things like that and kind of show groupings. You could also use a double number line. But these are kind of probably the 3 most commonly used strategies.